Talking Transport, the podcast from the Transport Network.
We're just days away from the ITS World Congress 2019, so while you're packing your bags, get yourself in the mood for the event with this preview podcast.
Coming up in today's edition.
Something for everyone, even if you're not going to Singapore, including talk about new mobility.
We try to capture all their views and ideas, which are quite different in either the delivery of transport or as users.
The intricacies of platooning.
If you've got an autonomous platoon and there's a conventional passenger vehicle approaching that platoon, and the platoon is not on a dual carriageway, then that passenger vehicle needs to execute an overtake manoeuvre. So the platoon needs to figure out that there's something behind it.
We discuss something taken for granted, accurate maps.
You can't have a service based on location without having location content. So content is foundational for us.
And bringing the next generation into the industry with a special program at Congress.
An executive program for youth to learn what's going on in the ITS community and connect to it.
Plus, veteran of every World Congress there's been, Professor Eric Sampson and his guide to the event. And keep listening for our brilliant visitor's guide to Singapore.
Talking Transport, brought to you thanks to WSP, Swarco, PTV Group, Jenoptik, here, Cohda Wireless and AGD Systems.
So you may remember in the last Talking Transport podcast, we previewed just a sort of idea of why Singapore is such a great place to have the Congress with Professor Eric Sampson, a man who's been to all 25 ITS World Congresses up to this one and will be at this one as well, and has been working very hard on putting together the programme for the event, or at least helping to do so. Eric, this time I just want to talk about the theme of the event, which is smart mobility empowering cities. So obviously you mentioned that Singapore is a very small city geographically, but very, very busy and lots of roads. So I guess this is the test case for smart mobility actually making the city run better.
Yes, the government's policy is to get people off the roads, or if they insist on using the roads, not to use them in single occupancy vehicles. So massive emphasis on public transport so that the road space occupied by, shall we say, 40 cars with one person in is instead occupied by a bus with 40 people in. And I think I mentioned before that there's a recruitment problem in Singapore, indeed quite a few places in the Far East. So they are looking at driverless vehicles in order to get rid of drivers. And the idea of platooning, where one vehicle slavishly follows the front one, is very, very popular there.
You mentioned that there was going to be a focus greater than ever before on freight. What are the other key things that we're going to be discussing at the event?
I think sustainability, in the sense of not so much the green agenda, but you can't go on eating the seed corn forever. At some point you've got to replace it. There's a colleague at Newcastle, Professor Taylor, who defines sustainability as enough for all forever. And Singapore certainly takes that to heart. They are very, very conscientious about this. And in the executive sessions and the 3 plenary sessions, you will see the theme of sustainability and smart mobility very, very strong through all of them.
Professor Eric Sampson will join us every day at the ITS World Congress in Singapore, telling us all about the must-attend sessions within the programme. Of course, there are loads of sessions that will be of interest to particular people. There are some that Eric has picked out that are vital that you do go along and take part in. We'll have details of those every day in Singapore. Eric will be joining me here on Talking Transport.
This is Talking Transport with Paul Hutton.
So while we've got all the exhibition and conference taking place in the Suntec Centre, and obviously the demonstrations outside on the floating platform, we've got lots of other social and interesting events taking place during the Congress week in Singapore. One of them takes place on the Monday while people are running around finishing off their last bits of exhibition stand building. At WSP, one of our sponsors for the podcast this week, are hosting a lunch reception just just over the road in the JW Marriott Hotel at Singapore's South Beach. And so to tell me more about this is Rehan Mian, who's Service Line Director for Strategic Modelling at WSP. Hi Rehan, how are you?
Hi, I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well indeed. So tell me, what's going to be taking place on the Monday in Singapore when it comes to your reception?
Oh, this is a very exciting tool that we've developed, which started about 4 years ago. So I'll give you some background of how we've got here. We had a client, Metrolink, ask us what the impacts of connected autonomous vehicles and mobility as a service would be on their business. Over the 4 years, we've been trying to look at this, and what we found was when we actually looked at all the interconnectivity of the transport system, users and clients, it was a very complex problem, indeed probably a wicked problem, not easy to grapple with. So we tried to simplify this problem around 4 pillars that we developed, which are based around what we see as the future in terms of connectivity and connected vehicles driven by data, automation, the full automation or semi-automation of vehicles, the propulsion method, which currently is pointing towards electric or could be something different in the future, and importantly the shared use model with new actors in the market that were entering at the time, such as Uber and Lyft that we're all familiar with now. And at the centre of all this would have been the user and the pricing model. So trying to bring all the complexity down into around these 4 pillars, we then started to talk to our clients about new mobility. And we tried to capture all their views and ideas, which are quite different in either the delivery of transport or as users of transport. But what we did find was there was an overarching view that there was a disconnect between the policy side of things and the actual deployment of the new technology and emerging transport modes.
So go on then, tell me more.
From this, we moved on to try and mapping the whole transport system into 3 processes. The first process being the scenario planning and looking at what might happen. The second process in this was actually the tool I'm going to talk about, the new mobility tool. And then probably a third step would be then to actually model all these futures using standard models or the new emerging models that we've got. So this tool that we're actually going to talk about on the Monday is Systems Dynamic Tool. So looking at the transport network as an integrated system. This is driven by something called causal loop diagrams. So if I can give a very simple example of this, if I'm waking up in the morning and I'm very, very tired, I drink coffee to get my energy levels up. But when it comes to the evening, I'm struggling to get to sleep. So I wake up the next morning even more tired, I drink more coffee and so on. So it's a reinforcing behavior. And there's lots of these causal loops in the system, which can either reinforce or actually can be a brake on different behaviors. And what we've done is we've brought together within those same 4 pillars that I talked about, different elements in the system. We're not saying that we can capture all the elements in the system, but certainly through our engagement with clients, a view of a lot of what those systems may be. And this tool is a fantastic opportunity to get decision makers in a room and partners to understand how these various causal loop diagrams and factors interact, how they interrelate, and what the impact of decisions that you make today might be on what a future transport network might look like. One of the problems we have is that the future scenarios, everyone understands what they might be, but no one can really see the incremental steps in terms of policy or technology that would be needed to actually get to that future. And this is where that tool comes in, and we would like to give our clients an opportunity to come and sit with us and look through how this works. And actually, by having the right people in the room, you can derive meaningful outcomes from this and help you plan into the future.
When you talked about the fact that there's a disconnect between planning and actually, to an extent, what people actually want out of their transport, how much are you understanding how to bridge that gap?
That's a very good question. So the user needs are essentially at the center of this process. Those needs are apparent for today's behaviors, but they're very difficult to predict into the future. So there is some element of looking at what those needs might be. And then, for example, a transport or an energy supplier to provide inputs to where we should locate electric charging points, for example. It's very difficult to do that without understanding what the future needs might be. So with this scenario tool, you can test alternative futures, for example, different levels of take-up of EV, so you don't over-provide or under-provide. The tool enables you to see how you would best respond to a particular scenario. It doesn't actually say what the scenario will be, but you can look at the range of outcomes and then test how robust your policy intervention may or may not be under those different scenarios.
Okay, so that's taking place on the Monday, as I say, while the final finishing touches are done to the exhibition, and the Congress main has started over the road in the Suntec Centre. But you're actually contributing to some of the Congress sessions as well.
That's right. Our head of discipline is actually presenting a number of papers. So we've got a paper on the Tuesday itself, where we're actually looking at connected vehicles and driver distraction, and we're trying to disentangle the ethics of that. We've got a paper presented on the Wednesday as well, looking at change in working patterns and how they might affect future mobility. And then on the Thursday, we have a third paper, which is looking at assessing tunnel safety risk. Very important to me personally, because we're working on the Stonehenge tunnel in the UK at the moment, and we're also working in the early stages of putting a tunnel between Sheffield and Manchester. So very interesting to me directly in the work that we're doing at the moment.
Rehan, that's great. I look forward to catching up with you and your colleagues at the Marriott on the Monday in Singapore, and we'll have further conversations then, and I'll actually get to see the tool being shown off. For the moment, thanks ever so much for taking the time to talk to us on Talking Transport.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Talking Transport, sponsored by AGD Systems, Cohda Wireless, here, Jenoptik, PTV Group, Swarco and WSP.
So let's talk to another of our sponsors on Talking Transport, looking ahead to Singapore 2019. And I've been joined by Paul Alexander, who is CTO of Cohda Wireless, who we are very grateful are supporting us this week. And on my notes in front of me, Paul, all I have is one word: platooning. So tell me more.
Sure. So I guess by way of background, Paul, Cohda's business is in software for connected vehicles. And of course, platooning is exactly in that genre. There are emerging standards to enable trucks to space themselves more tightly and operate autonomously in order to drive fuel and human resource improvements. So we're in the middle of developing some proof of concepts and early development phase versions of the software that would be fitted to trucks to enable them to platoon autonomously. The software is responsible for the connectivity between the trucks principally, but it also does touch a little bit on the autonomy side.
So this is very exciting and very groundbreaking stuff. There have been other platooning trials around the world. How are you taking this on?
Really what we do at Cohda is we build products against emerging standards. So what we see happening in Europe in particular is the Ensemble group of truck manufacturers have got together and they've got a candidate standard that they're building out. They're still in development phase with that, and eventually it would become potentially an ETSI standard. So it's very bleeding edge ideas and standardization. It's about multi-brand interoperable platooning. So the standard would be open, and this is a little bit, I suppose, special. The other thing that Cohda brings is we don't only build out that capability for our customers, but we bring value-added features. And we have, in the platooning case, one that we bring is redundant ranging between the vehicles. So not only do we do the communications piece, we actually reuse the radio communications itself to provide a redundant sensor around the spacing of the vehicles. Whilst we focus on European and North American and increasingly Asian markets, there are some special cases that we have here in Australia that do apply in certain other regions. One of them is if you've got an autonomous platoon and there's a conventional passenger vehicle approaching that platoon, and the platoon is not on a dual carriageway, then that passenger vehicle needs to execute an overtake maneuver. So the platoon needs to figure out that there's something behind it and break apart a little bit, perhaps not disassemble the platoon, so the platoon survives this and allows space for that vehicle to overtake. So that's particularly important in regional roads that are in the middle of nowhere that aren't huge capacity, but there's a single lane. So that's one of the unique things that we have worked on. There are several others, so we are definitely focused on the dual carriageway or even 3-lane situation.
And so what sort of timings before these are commonplace on the roads?
Good question. The OEMs themselves are fairly advanced. They have done a number of trials already, but this interoperable standard is being proved out over the next year or so. When it comes into their products is, I'm going to have to say TBD. The technology is effectively there. There are challenges though, not least of which is around what spacing can be achieved. So the tighter you can space the vehicles, the better you can do in terms of the value proposition of platooning. And that's what we're working on very hard. We've been able to achieve in our test environment. So at Cohda, we do have a number of autonomous vehicles that we test on test tracks. And we've got down to about a 0.4 of a second gap there. Now, taking that and putting it into a production environment is another step. So we need to talk about the braking performance of the multi-brand trucks when we have those kinds of spacings present. So resolving that braking behaviour of the trucks versus the spacing we're trying to go for across the next year or two is going to be the challenge.
And what else are we going to be finding out about Cohda when you and I meet up in Singapore?
I said that Cohda is really about connected vehicles and connected autonomous vehicles specifically. So the other, I guess, forward-looking work that we're doing is around collective perception. That's where an autonomous vehicle or even a smart intersection may be equipped with various perception capabilities. Collective perception is about sharing sensors from other autonomous vehicles or even smart intersections, which enables autonomous driving functions to make better decisions based on more information because they have an extended perception horizon. So this is our work on collective perception. It's being standardized. Again, it's in the early stages of standardization, but the devil is in the implementation details. So we'll be bringing that forward in the next little while out of Cohda as well.
We'll find out more, Paul, when we meet on your stand in the Suntec Exhibition Center in Singapore. For now, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Paul.
That's Paul Alexander. He's CTO of Cohda Wireless, one of our sponsors this week on Talking Transport.
Talking Transport, looking ahead to the ITS World Congress in Singapore.
You're listening to Talking Transport, brought to you by me, Paul Hutton, the editor of Smart Highways magazine, with these podcasts sponsored by our friends at AGD Systems, Cohda Wireless, Jenoptik, PTV Group, Swarco, WSP and HERE. And let's chat to HERE now about the unsung but vital role maps make in modern day life. We use them all the time without really thinking about their importance. But when you consider what you do every day, even away from work, anything from your sat-nav to finding a business online to find my friends on your phone to maybe even your teenager's car insurance solution, all of them rely on having an accurate digital map. Now, Matthias Eriksson is an SVP and head of product at HERE Technologies, and I met up with him and suggested that since he was in charge of mapping in a company that uses maps in all its products, he must be the most important man in the company.
Clearly, and I'm so happy that you brought that up. I tend to try to tell people that, but it's a struggle.
Right, and so, but you have got 5,500 people all working for you on this core map.
Jokes aside, obviously content is the foundation for everything we do. And if you think about the company's organized in a stack, an IT stack. So we have a content org, we have a platform org, and we have a service org. But you can't have a service based on location without having location content. So content is foundational for us. You want to know a little bit about the history. So if I start there, if you go back, 10, 15 years in time, and you think about how maps were built at that point in time, you essentially did two things. You bought a lot of data, so you had people going out into the world sourcing, field data surveys and so forth, bought government data, etc. Whoever had location data, you approached and you bought their data. And then you took that data, you put it in a big bucket, and you started figuring out what you wanted to do with that data and what was missing. And then you deploy your own people, your field people, to build the stuff that wasn't in whatever you could buy. So essentially, mapping 10, 15 years ago was about industrial sourcing and industrial capture. And we were very, very good at that. A portion of this company came from that background. The company was called Navtech, if you remember the history. They were very, very good, world leading at doing precisely that. Over the last, I would say, 5 to 7 years, the way you build a map has fundamentally changed. And what has changed is essentially that 3 massive technology trends have started influencing what you can actually do. There are many trends affecting location, but if you simplify it as much as you can, there are literally 3. The first one is obviously the sensor explosion. So over the last 5 to 7 years, you've had all these sensors being deployed by everybody in all industries, and these sensors are stepwise collecting more and more, and they're becoming more intelligent and so forth. And almost all data being collected by sensors today have a location component on it. The second thing that has happened is obviously that connectivity has become ubiquitous. So everywhere in the world, these sensors are connected not just to the cloud, but also to each other. And they collect an enormous amount of data. The third thing that has happened is, and that's a little bit more recent, I would say 4 or 5 years ago, this became a really hot topic for us, is that we have capabilities to analyze and manage data that didn't exist before. So using machine learning algorithms, using data analytics, for the first time in history, you're actually able to take these massive flows of data, conflate them and extract features from them and manage that flow. We started transformation late 2010, adapting our entire build process and our entire architecture of the database to take advantage of these new technologies. In parallel with the technology evolution, and partially because of the technology evolution, the requirements that customers started having on these types of location databases also changed. And to make a long story short, the customers started asking for step change in everything that matters about the database. Simplistically, there are 4 things that matters about a location database. Coverage matters. The accuracy of the database matters, the richness of the database matters, and last but not least, the freshness. And those 4 dimensions, if you think about what has happened over the last 5 to 7 years, have all started experience not incremental improvement, but step change. Let me give you some examples. If you think about accuracy, maps of the road network has moved from 95% attribute level quality to 99% and 3 nines. And if you're talking about where HD is going, it's literally 4 nines and so forth. If you think about richness, what has happened is that we used to have a fairly simplistic 2D centerline representation of the road network. Now it's all 3D, and it's not just the road network, it's also what's outside of the road network. So for all of these important components of the map, how we build it and the tools you need and the processes you apply have radically changed over the last 5 to 7 years. And we've been through this large-scale transformation that has allowed us to start capitalizing on these new ways of building the map. And that brings us a little bit back to where we are today. Today, more data flows to us in real time from these non-industrial processes based on these new technologies than from traditional sourcing and industrial capture and so forth.
That's a man who's so fascinating. I ended up talking to him for about half an hour, and I'll put that on a special podcast after Singapore for you. We'll find out much more about some major announcements here are making, which will have a real effect on the whole ITS industry when I bring you our podcast from Congress from Monday, the 21st of October.
Talking Transport, sponsored by AGD Systems, Cohda Wireless, here, Jenoptik, PTV Group, Swarco and WSP.
Now, almost by definition, the majority of people who come to speak and network at an ITS World Congress will be more experienced and therefore generally at the older end of the spectrum. But of course, it's important that we start to develop the next generation of professionals. Otherwise, what's going to happen in a few years' time when the current lot all retire? So one of the really good ideas at ITS World Congress 2019 in Singapore is the Youth Leadership Development Programme. So I'm going to find out a bit more of that by talking to the head of that subcommittee, Shurav Bhattacharya. Shurav, this is the first time the Congress is hosting a regional youth development programme. Why do you find it so important?
Building the next level of competency as well as the next level of leaders for ITS is an incredibly important activity. And from that perspective, where better than in Singapore, because we ourselves are a very small country, of course, but surrounding us is the whole of the Asia Pacific. Bringing representative youth from the region is perhaps the best way to get that diaspora going. That's why we thought of it. Of course, if you have seen the earlier World Congresses, it used to be more of a sideline program. But as you will see when you attend ITS World Congress this time, we are co-located at the same event. So even the senior generation can come and meet us, can see the youth, and perhaps even inspire them at the same location. We actually started out with the program to be more inclusive to Asia Pacific, but we ended up with more like an executive program for youth to learn what's going on in the ITS community and connect to it, as well as connect with some of the dignitaries so that they have almost a leg up in their own careers going forward.
Now, we're recording this interview the morning after an event I was at in London with the ITS UK Young Professionals Forum, and it was really exciting to see their ideas and their enthusiasm. That's one country's young professionals. You've got 15 countries represented here with 60 participants. What are they like?
In our case, it's a big diversity. It's something more than what we could have bargained for when we started out with designing this program about 5 years back when we were still bidding for the World Congress. So to give you an idea, we have ended up with something that's a diversity of almost 1:1, male to female. To be perfectly accurate, it's 45% to 55%, but that's better than what we would have hoped for at one level. Two, we have a age group that's spreading from about 18 years old, where it's mostly from Singapore in polytechnics, all the way to 28, where we have even PhDs coming from Singapore or overseas. So we have a fair spread of bachelor's, master's, PhD students. When we get into their backgrounds, because we want it to be all inclusive, given that ITS in the space of smart cities is becoming very, very cross-functional or across disciplines and in training, we have people from electronics and computer engineering background. We have people from international relations and policy background, all the way to the very traditional civil engineering and business backgrounds in our domain. So the diversity is quite huge, and hence we expect a large amount of debate and discussion in the Ideathon that we are going to manage for them.
And what sort of activities will they be getting involved in?
It's almost like an executive program or a leg up into the industry. So the first 2 days, which is actually the Friday and Saturday before the event itself, we are taking them through an immersion program where we take them out to companies, to testing and research labs, to the ITS Center of Singapore and the Land Transport Authority's Operations Command Center, so that they get a wide variety of ideas on what's going on in ITS, all the way from autonomous vehicles testing and research to the use of technologies and ITS command center operations to manage traffic and congestions, to even an incubator where companies relating to GIS and ITS technologies are actually focused on building themselves up as a startup. And that I think is very exciting, because who knows, maybe some of these youngsters will not even join the traditional companies. They might go out and start their own startups. And then what we will be doing at the co-located program within the ITS World Congress at Suntec Singapore is the ideation, where we can't even guess what will come out of these discussions. We are focusing them on leveraging ITS to promote active mobility for young, elderly, and disabled. And this particular topic touches differently for different countries, as you can imagine. So they will be taken through that, whereby at the very end they will be presenting to a distinguished panel, and we will be giving out the top 4 prizes on the basis of the selection by the panel.
And so the panel will get to meet them. What about the rest of us at the event?
We have taken pains to interleave the youth leaders with the attendees of the World Congress. Of course, a lot will be left to the initiatives of the individuals, but to start with, we are hosting a dinner for the youth leaders together with the ITS organizing committee, along with invited guests on Friday itself, the first day of the event when they come in. In fact, the whole event is going to be kicked off by the Senior Parliamentary Secretary, Mr. Bae Yam Keng. I wish I had this kind of context at the beginning of my own professional career. And then we are not keeping them locked up in a room through the event. We are actually making them a part of the whole event by, of course, co-locating them. But that also gives them the opportunity to come for the opening ceremony. We're also giving them bright T-shirts, marking them as youth leaders, so that they can be very identifiable through the whole event, where usually people wear jackets and suits. So I'm sure they will stand out quite loud and hard.
Well, I look forward to meeting them and spotting them in their bright T-shirts as we walk around the Suntec Centre. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll catch up again in one of our programmes from Singapore. For the moment, Sharav Bhattacharya, thank you very much for your time.
Look forward to seeing you there. Thank
So
you.
you're listening to Talking Transport from Smart Highways magazine, and let's wrap up with another chat about what to expect in the city and indeed the country of Singapore when we head to the Congress later in the month. And I've been joined again by Professor Matt Bentley. Now, Newcastle University in the UK has a branch campus, a presence in Singapore, and Professor Matt Bentley is the CEO and Dean of it. He's been living in Singapore for about 3 years now. One of the things, Matt, that the organisers of the Congress were very, very keen to encourage visitors to do is not just to show up in time for the opening of the Congress and then head home the moment it finishes, but to add some tourism time before and after. And I'm lucky enough to be arriving first thing on the Saturday before the event and heading home late on the Sunday after the event, so I have got time to see the place. So mark my card, what are the really key places that I have to go and visit during my time there?
Well, there are a number of places that people will ask if you've seen, and probably the first one is, did you go on the sky deck at Marina Bay Sands? And this is the classic view you see of Singapore with 3 towers, which is the Marina Bay Sands Hotel, with a boat-like structure with a large cantilever across the top, and on the top there swimming pools, cocktail bars and so on. And that's one of the sort of must-dos if you want to tick it off your list. Having said that, there are other venues which are equally high or higher, which are less well known. One is One Altitude, which is the world's highest open-air cocktail bar and is considerably higher than Marina Bay Sands. And perhaps Level 33, which, as it suggests, is 33 stories up with an open balcony, which is, I think, the world's highest craft brewery. So those are some places to visit, but Marina Bay Sands would be first, along with Merlion Park, Gardens by the Bay, and Singapore Botanic Gardens is absolutely exquisite.
Just sounding fantastic. We talked last time about the weather and the fact that it's extremely humid. So beaches, it's an island, there must be some fantastic beaches as well.
Fantastic. It has beaches. On the island itself, the main island of Singapore, East Coast Park is probably the best it can offer in beaches. Most people head to Sentosa, which is obviously a centre, a mecca for tourism, which has maintained beaches, has Universal Studios and a number of attractions like the Southeast Asia Aquarium and so on. So plenty of tourism on the island of Sentosa, accessible by cable car, bus or sort of monorail train from Singapore.
And for culture and so forth, just flicking through the guidebook, it looks like some amazing looking temples in the place as well.
There are a number of fantastic temples, some of which are less well known, but in Chinatown you have the Buddha Tooth Relic Temple and the Sri Miriam Temple, so a couple of Buddhist and Sikh temples there. A really nice quarter to visit is Kampong Glam, and Kampong Glam is the Malay quarter of Singapore, where you have the Sultan Mosque. You also have a lot of fabulous Middle Eastern restaurants and a lot of sort of small trendy bars and some independent shops selling clothes and jewellery. Fabulous place to visit.
And finally, with me being a Brit, the interesting thing is, of course, Singapore only got its independence in the mid-60s. How much of a British influence is still in the place?
Like many ex-colonial places, Singapore has its relics and its affiliations with the UK and with Sir Stamford Raffles and everything else. It's a very warm and opening society. It recognises the contribution that the UK or Britain actually made to its inception and its independence. And so it's proud of all of its multiculturalism. Obviously the majority of the population are Chinese, the next largest component are Malay, with Indians, and then the rest of us, a very small proportion these days. So whilst it comes from the British colonial tradition, it's a very modern, forward-thinking country with, at the moment, Lee Hsien Loong as the Prime Minister, Chinese, Singaporean, but Halima Jacob, who is the president, is Muslim. So it's multicultural and multi-religious right from the bottom up, if you like.
Matt, thank you ever so much for giving us just this tiny taste of what to expect when we come to the World Congress. And you talked about those craft beers. I owe you a couple when I'm in Singapore. We'll meet up and we'll have a drink. Okay, thanks very much indeed for your time.
Thanks, Paul. You're welcome.
I'm so looking forward to my first trip to Singapore now. If you're still umming and ahhing about coming along, I hope that's convinced you to find the time and budget to do so. But remember, remember that even if you can't make it, I'll be bringing you a summary of what's being talked about, demonstrated and exhibited every day. So wherever you are in the world, find yourself half an hour to listen to Talking Transport. For now, I'll finish my packing and try and work out how to stay sane on a 14-hour flight, and leave you with final thanks to WSP, Swarco, PTV, Jenoptik, here, Cohda Wireless and AGD Systems for their support, and we'll talk again from Singapore.
Talking Transport is produced and presented by Paul Hutton for the Transport Network suite of products.